In some countries, they are called debt bulletins. For example, here in Nigeria, the Debt Management Office publishes these debt bulletins periodically, quarterly. There are countries where this report is called the debt report. That's just the name of it. And so what is the composition of the debt report? I think it's important for parliamentarians to familiarize themselves with how this debt report looks like and what is in it, before you can then begin to analyze the information and see what key deductions you can make from it to inform your oversight responsibility. Most debt reports will typically have the total debt stock, which I'm sure most of us will know, which is the overall, the aggregate debt that has been taken on by a particular country. And then there is a disaggregation of this debt into external and domestic debt, right? But it doesn't stop there. Apart from that, there is also the distribution of the debt. So if you take the external debt, then you try to disaggregate that into what part of this external debt is concessional, what parts of this external debt is commercial, and so on. So there is a further disaggregation of the external debt, as well as the domestic debt also. You can also further disaggregate that in terms of what actually is in this domestic debt. So the debt report would have that. And then fourthly, the debt report will normally have what is called net borrowing, which is a projection of how much is expected to be borrowed over a certain period, right? So it could be the next quarter, it could be the next 6 months, or it could be the next year. You can have a very good projection in terms of what the estimates are for borrowing. And then there is also a further disaggregation. If you go back to the debt stock, disaggregated it into external and domestic debt, you can also disaggregate that by creditor. So, for example, you can disaggregate the report, either the external component or the domestic component, by who did we borrow the money from. Perhaps some money may have been taken from bilateral creditors or multilateral creditors. Whatever the case may be, there is also a disaggregation of that. So you can tell, out of our total debt stock, who do we owe the most? Do we owe most to multilateral creditors or bilateral creditors or commercial creditors, for example? So that is also very useful information that you will get. And then the other part that you will get from this debt report is how much you are actually servicing the debt for, which is the interest payment, right? How much of our money are we using to fund this debt that has been procured? And then there is an aspect of the debt report which is also very critical, which is guarantees and contingent liabilities. Some debt reports don't have this, but in order for the debt report to be comprehensive, you need to make sure that there are guarantees and contingent liabilities that are clearly articulated as part of those debt reports. And beyond that, there is the analytical piece which we'll get. So you have the data sets, and then you have sections of the debt report which looks at some analysis. There was an extensive discussion about debt sustainability here, so I'm not going to go into that, which is to say that given the debt levels that we have, are we sure that as a nation, these levels are sustainable, financially sustainable over the medium term, over the long term, and so on. So there is some analysis that is done as part of this debt report. So often when you get them, you will see that some attempt has been made, and this analysis is done based on varying degrees of information that's available to the person who is presenting the report. And then as part of this debt sustainability analysis, there is what is called fiscal risk analysis, which is to say that given the amount of debt that we have, what are the fiscal risks that we envisage that is associated with this debt? That is to say that if we look at our public finances, are we sure that we have the capacity to service this debt over the long term? And if so, or if not so, what do we need to do to address some of the risks that can emerge as a result of having this debt? Now, part of my presentation, I think I'll spend more time on that, is to look at some of these risks, which I think will be of interest to the members of parliament that are here, because I think if we understand the risk, then it will help us to be able to perform our oversight functions properly. Then, obviously, there is an aspect of the debt report that talks about new issuances. So I'm sure you may have heard that term, new issuances. These days, in our region, issuances are done in the secondary market. There are also issuances that are done in the primary market, both in foreign currency as well as in domestic currency. So some of the issuances could be treasury bills, for example, if you want to use that as an example. And then also some countries issue euro bonds to raise more money for capital projects. So you have a section of the debt report that talks that you've heard about, debt to GDP, inflation rate, the economy. Now, I will spend much of my time now talking about some of the risks that are inherent in debt, and then obviously give some kind of examples elsewhere, so that it will help us to really prioritize this topic when we go back to our countries. One of the key, how much of the debt is external debt related to domestic debt, right? And there is an inherent risk in there, because if your debt is overwhelmingly composed of external debt, you would have, because you have to be able to raise revenue and convert that to foreign currency before you actually make the payments. So one of the key risks is this ratio of external to internal. How much of your debt is external debt and how much of your debt is internal debt? I think there was a statistic that was shown about Japan, which showed that Japan's debt was over 200% of GDP. It will be of interest to know that much of that debt is domestic debt. And, you know, Japan can survive because domestic debt, by all means, is cheaper. And the extent of an economy to the Japanese economy coming from external debt will not be as much as, you know, if much of this debt was external. So if you have an overwhelming size of debt, which is debt that is incurred domestically, this ratio, you know, is somehow manageable. But if you have a lot of debt that is external debt, then you have to really understand that when there is a shock to your country, or when there's a shock, you need to be able to pay that debt. Okay, so let's give some examples. So for example, you know, most of us heard about the crisis in Greece. I think it was somewhere around 2007 through 2010 when Greece went into financial crisis. And the reason why much of this happened in Greece was because a huge part of the Greece debt was external debt. And when the Greece economy tumbled, they could not. So that's one example. So if you have a huge debt overhang that is exclusively or majority of it is external debt, then you have a situation where you are not able to raise revenues to be able to this debt. The other country that ran into a similar problem like this is Sri Lanka. Most of us may have heard the Sri Lanka issue, which actually culminated in the overthrow of the government. So there's also sovereign risk that is associated with this, right? So in the case of Sri Lanka, they borrowed massively to fund a port project in Sri Lanka. And much of the financing was coming from China. And there were certain clauses that were included in it. And for some reason, the port project did not generate the revenue. And so, as a result, you know, paying this debt became a challenge. And one of the clauses in the debt document was that if Sri Lanka couldn't generate the revenue that they needed to fund the debt, then the port goes over to China. And so China actually took over the port in Sri Lanka on Sri Lankan land, and then began to manage the port so that they can manage the port and collect revenue over time, be able to defray the cost of the debt. Can you imagine the number of years that this lease has been given back to China? Is about 99 years. So China will be in Sri Lanka. Calls for your attention when you get your debt report is to look at the maturity of the debts that are included in the debt report. Why maturity? If you know, when maturity, most debts, you have short-term and long-term debts. So short-term debts are debts that are usually paid within a fairly short period of time, maybe less than 1 year. And then long-term debts would be something after a year or two and so on. If you see your debt report and you see that a large portion of that debt report has short-term maturity, you have to realize that there is a very high risk of running into what is called rollover risk, and I'm going to explain this. So that's in our country, from I hope you can hear me. Term debt is can you hear me? Okay. So much of the short-term debt is financed with treasury bills. So you have 80-day treasury bills, 180 days treasury bills, and so on, which is fine. But the fundamental assumption for issuing the treasury bill is that when the government reissues the treasury bills, which in most cases they will have to, because the debt that they have raised is supposed to be funding some projects which are not short-term, right? So there is a mismatch between the projects that the debts are funding and the maturity of the debt. So if they issue a 90-day treasury bill or 180-day treasury bill, you can be sure that this treasury bill will be rolled over when the maturity of the treasury bill arrives. And so if you have a lot of short-term debt, the assumption is that when the government comes back to the market to issue more treasury bills, it means that people will subscribe these treasury bills and they can generate the amount of revenue they need, sometimes to pay off the principal and interest of the treasury bills that were issued, so that they can extend the duration of the loan or the debt that they have. So there is this inherent assumption of rollover, which sometimes doesn't happen. Okay? And I'm sure you may have heard in some of the countries that the Ministry of Finance or the Debt Management Office went out to do issuances, and the issuances were undersubscribed. You may have heard that maybe in some of your respects. If this happens for a period of time, then you have to realize that the government is running into some liquidity issues, because they are not getting the amount of cash to finance debt that they, in order for them to issue new debt. So we need to be use this one? Okay, perfect. So the key point is, when you have a lot of short-term maturity, you have to realize that there's a very high liquidity risk that you can run into as a country, especially when new debt is issued and the debt is undersubscribed. So, honorables, as you go back, please listen to that being made. If there is a consistent undersubscription of these new issuances, then you need to be smelling something. Something is coming down the pipe, because they are not able to raise enough funds to be able to either retire the debt that they issue or even fund new obligations. And this happened in Ghana. Most of us are familiar with the Ghanaian story, where they have had to renegotiate with a lot of domestic creditors for them to take haircuts, because the government couldn't raise enough funds to be able to fund a lot of the obligations. So these things can actually crystallize. The people who will suffer in this particular case will be the citizens, because most who are buying these treasuries, or institutional investors in the country, banks, pension funds, insurance agencies who have actually loaned money to the government, who now have to take haircuts because the government is not able to raise enough money to be able to fund those short-term obligations. Okay, so that's one other area that I'd like to encourage you to pay attention to, the portion of the debt that is short-term maturity versus long-term. If it is long-term, there is some scope, you know, be 5 years, there is some scope for negotiation, there is some scope to do some fiscal consolidation, to be able to either rein in on expenditure and, you know, sort of reallocate some monies to pay in debt. But when it is short-term, it can be very severe and sharp. The impact could be very severe as well. And then one other area which is quite important is, which is related to one of the points that I made, has to do with concessional versus non-concessional lending. And I've heard a lot in this room about multilaterals and so on. But one of the things you will see on your debt report is whether or not this debt is concessional or not concessional. That is why I made the point earlier on to say that when you get your debt report, please pay attention to the disaggregation of the debt number. It's just not the total number. Look at what is inside the total amount of debt. So concessional borrowing is the type of borrowing that you would typically get from the World Bank or the IMF. These are loans that are softer in nature in terms of the duration, the payment, as well as the interest rates that the creditors are asking for. Non-concessional borrowing is borrowing that is done on commercial terms. You know, these are things that you get on the market, right? So it's not soft in its nature. Now, the reason why this is important is that when the debt profile of a country deteriorates, it becomes very difficult for the country to get concessional borrowing, because it would have to now the World Bank and the rest of the multilaterals to show that, well, your macro is looking good or your fiscal is looking good, and for them to actually lend you more money. So if you have a portfolio or your debt portfolio which is concessional borrowing and your fiscal deteriorates, then you have to understand that there is that this could trigger some intervention from the World Bank, and getting more money from them will be difficult. Now, what that means is that you will now have to turn to non-concessional borrowing. You need the money to be able to fund some obligations. And as was said in the room, some people even said that some countries were borrowing to fund recurrent costs. Right? So if the amount of concessional borrowing goes down, then countries are forced to now go for non-concessional borrowing, and which I can tell you that a lot of the countries in this room have had to do that over several years. And this is where the challenge is, right? Because once you begin to spend a lot more money on your non-concessional borrowing and the interest rate is high, so it means that you're taking on more financial responsibility when you are already weak. And we've seen that happen. We've seen this happen in a lot of countries. Somebody mentioned Kenya, and they weren't getting a lot of funding from some of these multilaterals, so they had to go to the market. And the rates at which they're raising these new loans from the market were quite high. Okay, so some are raising new money, Eurobonds at 9%, at 10%, and these are very high amounts for countries that normally would not be able to borrow at that level. It's a lot of cost to the citizens of the country to be borrowing at those rates. So please pay attention to the proportion of concessional to non-concessional borrowing, where everybody agrees that if you are lending a lot more from the non-concessional side, make sure that there are cash flows that one can actually project to be able to meet such non-concessional borrowing. And I can guarantee you, once your macro goes down, the non-concessional borrowers know that you are on your knees. So they will also increase the rates because they are in to make profit, obviously, and they will increase the rate. And if you procure the loan, ultimately it is your citizens that will end up paying for that amount of money. Lastly, one area where I'd like to encourage us to look at is around contingent liabilities. This area often evades a lot of people, even finance professionals. Sometimes we don't pay enough attention to contingent liabilities. What are these contingent liabilities? These are obligations that are likely to happen that could trigger a financial commitment from your government. Okay, they haven't happened yet. But there is the possibility that within the fiscal year or within a time horizon, these things can happen. It could be, some guarantee that the government gave to a particular subnational. It could be some on-lending that was done with the hope that the subnational or the entity could be able to raise money to fund this obligation over time. And the government said that if they don't meet that obligation, we will be able to make that obligation or be able to we'll stand in for them. So these are contingent liabilities. And frankly, this particular area is challenging because not a lot of the debt reports report fully on these contingent liabilities. There is a lot of work that they have to do to understand which corporations or which states or which entities the government actually maybe guaranteed loans for, or which are the events that can happen in the economy that could trigger some financial commitment from the government. So there's a lot of work that needs to be done. And sometimes the people that prepare the debt report. So please, if you get your debt report, please by all means pay attention to the contingent liabilities that are there. And maybe ask some questions. Are we sure that these are all the contingent liabilities that could happen in this country that could trigger a financial obligation from the government? The expectation is that, one, these contingent liabilities should be provided for in the budget. So when you get your budget, those of us that are contingent liabilities in the budget, that would mean that if something happens during the budget year, there are funds that have been accrued aside to make sure that this contingent liability is met. So that could be one area. But ultimately, when you get the debt report, also make sure that the debt report contingent liabilities. You could have explicit contingent liabilities, which everybody knows, But you could also have implicit contingent liabilities, which are not very clear, but then still have the potential that the government could be asked to fund some of that obligation. Let me give you an example, because it will actually drive home the point. All of us are familiar with what happened in the US in 2007, right, when we had the financial. Okay, so this means that if the government doesn't have the money, they have to issue treasury bills, or maybe issue some bonds to be able to raise the money to go and rescue the banks. So this is borrowing that was not anticipated, but because something happened in the economy, the government now is put on the line to go and borrow to be able to fund that. So I would like to suggest that contingent liabilities is one of the areas where you should please pay attention to. Are there some public-private partnerships that have been entered into that the government has provided guarantees, for example? You should be able to ask some of those questions. Are there some state-owned enterprises in your country that the government has provided some guarantees for in order for them to loan money, for example? Those are all things that you want to be able to see on the debt report when you get it. So maybe I would like to wrap up because of time, Mr. Chair, but I'd like to just share a few insights on what we consider as some of the global best practices for reviewing that report, and then maybe I will stop here and see if there are any questions. Encouraging parliamentarians to understand debt on and off the balance sheet. Okay, and here there is a lot of complementarity that can happen between public accounts committees and finance committees, because public accounts committee people normally understand financial statements. So when you talk about balance sheets, these are people that will normally get the financial statements and will review them and obviously will ask questions on these balance sheets. But I can guarantee you that there's a lot of lending, or there's a lot of borrowing, to be specific, that happens that is not put on the financial statements of countries. And I'm sure there is a country in this room I don't want to mention. They are actually going through a lot of challenges. A lot of that borrowing was done and was not reported on the balance sheet. And so that can be something that could be a challenge. So I'd like to encourage members to actually take some effort to understand what borrowing is going on that is reported on the balance sheet or on the financial statement, and what is not reported either on the financial statement or on the debt bulletin. So that's one. Two, set up a legislative framework for debt management. I don't know if all the countries that are represented in this room have a debt management law. Maybe if you are here and you have a debt management law, or some, if you don't have that, then I'd like to encourage you to advocate for that. Maybe put that as part of the legislative agenda when you go back, in consultation with other members of parliament, to say we need to have a legal framework for addressing the issue of debt in our country. So that one. And of course, we heard so many things about ratifying loan agreements. Unfortunately, there are countries in our region that still don't follow the parliamentary process of ratifying loan agreements. Some agreements are discussed in parliament, and some agreements are not discussed in parliament. And so it will be important to make sure that all of the loans that are being contracted are discussed in parliament, and the agreements are understood by everybody. Because some countries have fragmented that report. There is some report here, there is some information. The regime in your country is fragmented. Make some noise and ask the preparers to please make an effort to provide one integrated debt report so that you can get a better eye view over what is going on. And then maybe the last point is pay attention to state-owned enterprises. Much of my work is around state-owned enterprises because of the fiscal risk they pose to the economy. State-owned enterprises, by and large, are necessary in some sectors, right? But then one challenge is that most of them are not run efficiently. And so they end up, and unfortunately some of them end up accruing loans and liabilities that the government will have to now cover. So please pay attention to them. Are there some loans on their books that are being reported on an aggregate basis for one to be able to understand the level of fiscal risk that they are taking on? So maybe I will stop here, Mr. Chair. I didn't talk about audit, but I'll be more than happy to talk about audit if there are any questions specifically on audit. But I just want to make sure that I observe the time and I don't really take too much liberty of the time that has been accorded me. Thank you.
I want to join colleagues to thank our presenter, and I'm sure our presenter will realize that it was not within time, but we allow him to continue because it's a sensitive topic. and it's a sensitive subject matter. Let me try as much as possible to summarize some of the critical things that you've presented to us. One of which is the risk lending. We must pay attention to our domestic, the breakdown of the debt bulletin. You must also be able to understand and dissect external versus domestic loan. And you must pay attention to the interest rates on lending. And we should look at government accessibility to loans, particularly those that are domestic and short-term as well as long-term loans. And he spoke about global best practices, and he ended up with paying attention to state-owned enterprises. I would allow colleagues to ask few questions, but before you do, let me make a comment on state-owned enterprises. Most of the state-owned enterprises created or operated in our countries are as a result of World Bank triggers, World Bank conditionalities to access budget support. And now these state-owned enterprises have become a burden on us. Now the World Bank is proposing a new structure. In Sierra Leone, for example, the World Bank is proposing that we pass a legislation that would set up a State-Owned Enterprises Act, which in effect would create a board that will supervise the boards of all the state-owned enterprises we have created in the past. How can you manage that? Because in most of these legislations that we are piloted by the World Bank, they inputted a provision. There is a provision in, or there are provisions in these legislations which says the board is independent and autonomous. How can they now be regulated by another superstructure, another board in the State-Owned Enterprises Act that the World Bank is pushing through? So colleagues, we've had, and I would like to take the Honorable from Gambia, right? I will take the Honorable from Gambia, the Honorable from Eswatini. Let's take the two, and I'll take, sorry, from Ghana, the Honorable from Ghana. Chairman, sorry. Let's listen to the chairman first.
Merci. Je voudrais féliciter et apprécier la clarité des interventions de notre responsable de la Banque mondiale. Et après cette intervention, je voudrais me poser la problématique de la coopération entre trois entités. La première entité, c'est l'exécutif, qui est en contact permanent avec la Banque mondiale lorsqu'il est question des rajeunissements structurels et lorsqu'il est question d'emprunt. Vous savez, la Banque mondiale joue le rôle de jugulateur, de modérateur dans toutes les actions d'endettement. C'est eux qui parlent d'un rajeunissement structurel, mais malheureusement, j'ai l'impression que l'intervention du Parlement est souvent biaisée. Et je voudrais ici profiter de cette opportunité que nous est offerte par la présence de cet agent, afin que désormais les parlementaires soient mis en avant. Parce que c'est nous qui représentons le peuple, c'est nous qui sommes là pendant un certain moment. Et si vous avez vu l'actualité actuellement en France, vous apercevez que la Commission des finances joue un rôle capital, surtout quant à ce qui concerne le budget. Et si le budget est mal de cette occasion, pour que désormais nous, parlementaires ici présents, nous prenons en compte notre rôle capital dans tout ce qui est endettement, dans tout ce qui est budgétaire. C'est vrai que nous jouons déjà un rôle sur le cycle budgétaire, mais quant à ce qui est l'endettement, souvent nous sommes mis en face devant les faits accomplis. Donc c'est pour ça que je voulais en profiter que le responsable de la Banque mondiale nous dise quelles sont leurs politiques en matière d'intégration totale, surtout quant à ce qui concerne l'endettement de nos pays. Je vous remercie.
Thank you, Chairman. Let me take the three colleagues and then we'll take Honorable.
Yeah. Thank you very much. Can I go ahead?
Sorry, I think we're having some adjustments. So the three colleagues from, members of parliament, particularly when you sit either as speaker or as chairman, you are advised by your clerk. The principal advisor to the chairman or the speaker is the clerk. And I've been ably advised by the clerk that we take the second presenter for 10 minutes and then we come back to the plenary, but certainly the plenary would have the opportunity to ask their question. So on that understanding, I will take the Honorable Zuma Abanta, a former member of parliament of the Nigerian House of Representatives, to give us an insight on the topic we are discussing, reading between the lines, how to interpret debt reports and audit findings. Honorable Member.
Thank you very much, the chair and listeners. This is a very, very important topic. We've learned a lot from it and discussed very, very much in the talks. However, I will want to standing the debt report or the audit report is very, very necessary for the survival of the nation. Debt is just the use and how it's been put. We've been given the metrics of understanding it. The problem here is that Parliament is not put in front before you get the budget, like the President said, where Parliament is in most cases being so interpreting the budget or speak cannot or debt cannot be interpreted properly, because from the day one, all we've been talking is the usefulness and how it can be well managed and so on. You cannot give what you don't understand, what you don't see. Using Nigerian experience, for example, most debts are known to Parliament after, in fact, the money had even been released. So you are not given the indices, you are not even told why the budget, why the debt came at all. So what are you going to interpret? You only interpret what you are part of the conception, part of the making, reason for making it. If, for example, you want to borrow money to do a railway, you should be made to know what is the kilometer, the mileage, the gauge, the cost, and the comparative, a uniform, a unified and codified system that they can work as a union to say every country must have XYZ minimum legal requirement of independence to be sure you can talk. Have it, but there must be friction, and the friction will come right from the oversight. I agreed the largest thing with the presenter of SIOS, and when he talked about using Nigerian Parliament to showcase a lot of things. So what do WAPAC do to make sure that legislatures have a very reasonable autonomy, a very reasonable independence? The executive will give you the sufficient ministry will give you, and so on. So what will use to work? So I want a situation where to be able to interpret to what extent is that power guaranteed, to what extent is it independent, to what extent they use it, just like other claims. Can the committee compulsorily summon whoever they want to talk to without political interference? So political interference is one of the things that is hindering reading in between lines. Tall orders will come, and again, the rate of turnover of legislators is a big problem. For the executives that do that, they have a time frame, they are there and so on, but you may not have political independence. The political will is what we have to really, really interpret and do that. So political will and capacity constraints is what is limiting this. And then those who give the money, like, so then those who give the money, like, they don't give legal regime that will guide all member states to work in unison. Thank you.
I want to thank the honorable member, and he has made, from what I have, a summary 6 very, very important points. And one of the most important I see, and it's more, I'm sure it's more in all other legislature across West Africa, is legislative independence. Parliament cannot summon without the intervention of the executive. Parliament cannot scrutinize to the end of any or every investigation without the executive asking us to cut in it short or not to put out a report. But we take the questions, and the honorable member from Gambia.
Thank you, moderator, and thank you, Mr. Chairman, Honorable Yusuf. In the Gambia, we have something we call the debt bulletin, which pretty much gives you...
I will give 2 minutes.
Sure.
For my clerk is advising me 1 minute, but pursuant to Standing Order 42 in Sierra Leone, I would rule that I give them 2 minutes.
Okay. All right. It's going to start on the next speaker. We have it aggregated into domestic debt and external debt. But most of the time, when you look at the issue of debt on the continent, and in particular in the West African region, there's one key area that we do not take a look at. For example, the value of our currencies in relation to the debt that we actually have. When you look at the Gambia, for example, 20 years ago, the dollar to the dollar was about $30 to the World Bank. Is how or what can we do together with you to ensure that we have the single currency, or at least try to as much as possible where our debt actually is reduced in such a way that these currencies that we actually have all over the continent would actually be reduced, because there's a big gap. In the Gambia, the last time I calculated, the debt that we actually are paying, 20 to 25% of the debt is not as a result of what we have taken, but as a result of the devaluation of our dollars. So I think that's something we really need to take a look at. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Honorable. The Honorable member from Eswatini. Eswatini, then Ghana. Eswatini, Ghana, and Mali, and then we'll close. We'll get a summary to all the questions from our presenter, and we'll thank them.
Thank you, Honorable Deputy Speaker. My colleague, I know what it means when you say 1 minute. What I want to ask is, why we are boasting of being the richest out loans and borrowings if we've got our natural resources at this point in time? I think there's a structural problem in Africa, right on the trajectory as Africa. A typical example would be, we've got stadiums which we have built for and play a soccer match in a neighboring state. So can't we see that we are having something very wrong as Africa? Are we prioritizing on our loans as to, does this go to sovereignty in our continent? So I think as Parliament, we should really start interrogating the executive. I thank you, Honorable Chair.
I thank the Honorable from Eswatini. I give the floor to the Honorable from Ghana.
Thank you, Right Honorable Speaker. My name is Frank Yabwa, Ghana. And this one goes to the fact that some debt stock or loans do not find their way onto the balance sheet or financial position of the country. So if that's the case, then how question is it among the best practices that we are supposed to adhere to? Thank you.
Finally, the Honorable from Mali.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur le modérateur. Pour la clarté de son exposé, parlait tantôt de quelques exemples de dettes, parmi lesquels il y a le cas du Sri Lanka. La Chine a suscité en moi, en fait, une certaine réflexion. Je me suis dit, s'il n'y a pas un lien de causalité entre soutenabilité et amortissement d'une dette, et surtout quand on parle aussi de dette perpétuelle, voilà, j'ai dit que voilà, c'est l'occasion, puisqu'on a la Banque mondiale devant nous, d'avoir son sentiment sur ce que recoupe une dette perpétuelle. Et puis,
I give the floor to our facilitator from the World Bank. It looks like most of the questions are for you. So if you could give us a summary, it would help us. You don't have a mic?
One minute. Okay. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just briefly, most of the comments that came along were around, the role of parliaments in making sure that you actually have access to these documents to review them. I fully agree. In most of the legal frameworks that you come from, I think the Constitution actually gives that mandate to Parliament to authorize the borrowing of money. And so if it's something that is not being done, I think that has to be corrected. It doesn't have to be the case that some borrowing is done and Parliament is sidestepped. And the same goes for renegotiation of loans. I think Mr. Chair talked about why the Parliament is sidestepped when there are negotiations or renegotiations of loans. Ultimately, this has to be ratified by Parliament. And so I fully agree, but I think each country would have to really pursue with the Ministry of Finance to make sure that they're actually involving them in the negotiations and that is approved. But just on the question of value of currency and devaluation, that is a very important question because we've seen so on. So I think that's one consideration that needs to be taken into account when you are borrowing in foreign currency denominated loans, to perhaps take into account this foreign currency risk and to see to what extent you are well adjusted to be able to undertake any shock. There are various ways to do that, but I would say that that should be one of the considerations. Otherwise, like you rightly say, and then you end up paying 3 or 4 times, you have to convert your local currency in order to make that payment. Maybe the question on some debts not making loans that are coming. Finally, on the Mali question, on sustainability, I think there was a lot of discussion about how that sustainability can be done, but there's some sovereign crisis. So the point I was making is pay attention to the details, because if you default on some of these commercial loans, obviously it might require you surrendering the assets that you use to secure the loan. So that was the point I was making. China's debt is about 90% to GDP, but they have been able to manage it because a lot of it is domestic debt. And I mentioned the case of Japan as well. A lot of levels are high. We are not saying it is a good practice to have high debt levels, but we are saying that if the composition is more of domestic debt, it makes the risks are much lower relative to external debt. Mr. Chair, I think this is probably what I could glean from the questions that came from. Swantini, I think the question was about the fact that there is something fundamentally wrong if we continue to talk about loans, given all of the resources that we have. I fully agree with you, Honorable. I think that the question comes back to us, how are we managing our resources and how best can we raise revenue domestically such that we don't have to rely so much on debt. Everybody knows that we need some amount of debt. You need it to be able to, meet shortfalls in your financing arrangements. But the question is, do you have to borrow so much to the point where it becomes unsustainable? So perhaps we should ask ourselves, what can we do with the resources that we have so that we don't have to rely so much on debt? And I think it's a question for all of us to ponder over. Thank you.
Well, we've learned a lot. It's for us to believe in that in communicates some resolutions will be reached as to how Parliament can look in between lines, how Parliament can assess the debt profiles before they come, how Parliament can authoritatively and independently look at these reports, because that is the basis for transparency. Thank you.
I want to thank our facilitators. Honorable members, can you please join me to thank our facilitators?
Thank you very much, the distinguished Deputy Speaker. Thank you, Dr. Maxwell. Thank you, Right Honorable Abonta. We invite Mr. President to give us a 1-minute closing statement. Then we go for lunch and close for the day. Please remember, as country delegations, you are to hold your strategy action point session that you will report at the General Assembly tomorrow. What 3 points are you going to be focused on? All right, I'm saying, Yeah, the 3-point action plan, each country will be focusing on. Arising from this engagement, when you go back, every country will report progress tomorrow on what 3 issues you will be focusing to address from this assembly. Yeah.
Merci. Merci, monsieur le modérateur. Je voudrais, encore une fois, Burkina Faso, malheureusement, n'a pas pu être parmi Côte d'Ivoire, et surtout le Ghana. La délégation du Ghana, est-ce qu'ils sont dans la salle? Ouais, mais ils sont là, des fusiliers. Ouais, merci d'être venus. La délégation de la... En forte délégation, merci pour votre engagement, puisque nous allons aborder les grandes lignes. Remercier surtout le Sénégal. Le Sénégal, vous êtes encore dans la salle, je pense. Vraiment vous remercier d'être venu. Demain, je vous prie d'être présent parce que nous aurons une adresse à faire à vous. Remercier la Sierra Leone, la Gambie. La Gambie, est-ce que vous êtes là? Oui. Remercier je ne voudrais pas terminer cette belle journée sans remercier le Togo pour tous les efforts qu'ils ont entrepris et vous dire que notre association, vu l'engagement, vu la salle encore pleine, nous serons, et surtout pour la responsabilité qui nous est donnée de tenir les finances de toute l'Afrique de l'Ouest, les 14 pays. Si nous ne sommes pas là, nous allons passer maintenant à ce que nous appelons le repas pour que chacun puisse encore déguster le bon repas du Nigeria. Le Nigeria, vous êtes très fort dans les repas, mais je pense que, je ne sais pas qui prépare, si c'est les femmes ou bien c'est les hommes, mais c'est très bon. C'est très très bon et tout le monde est content et tout le monde mange à sa faim. Remercier les femmes, remercier les Nigérians et puis vous dire que nous allons revenir un jour encore à cause du repas parce que nous avons été très bien accueillis, surtout à Abuja. Merci beaucoup et bon appétit à chacun de nous. Et demain matin, à partir de 9h, nous nous retrouvons ici pour la cérémonie. C'était un peu à Abuja. Je pense qu'il y a beaucoup de choses à découvrir. Hein. Vous allez nous aider à découvrir Abuja pour que nous partions avec des souvenirs. Merci et bonne soirée.
Thank you, Mr. President, for that elaborate commendations. We are grateful. We shall invite Mr. President for group photograph with the resource person, the presiding officer, and the deputy Jeremiah. Please, the group photograph. By 9 a.m. tomorrow, by the leave of the President, the General Assembly will commence. All honorable MPs are expected to be at this conference hall by 9 a.m. Thursday, we are having the tour of Abuja City, and that will also commence in the morning by 9 a.m. That is on top. Okay. All right, so please, after this group photograph, we are proceeding for lunch, and from there we have a nice day. Thank you very much.
ké fún wọn ní children education.